Good evening, everybody. How are you doing? It is Thursday, the 27th of August. I'm Cherri Gregg, and this is Real Talk with Cherri, my community give back. I've been doing this for several months, talking about a variety of topics from politics to COVID-19 to businesses, all sorts of things. Thank you, everybody who's tuning in. Please tag a friend and share this video. I'm really excited tonight. Last week, I brought on folks and we talked about the Democratic National Convention. So this week, I have a guest and we're going to talk about the Republican National Convention. A few months ago, I had the pleasure of covering a Black Voices for Trump event in North Philadelphia. It was a packed room at a church in North Philadelphia. And I ran into a gentleman who's been a guest on my show, Flashpoint, a number of times, and Mr. Calvin Tucker. He is the Pennsylvania GOP Director of Engagement and Enhancement. I think I'm saying that correctly. And so he's here today, and I'm going to give him give just a moment for you guys to tag a friend and share this video. Let them know that you all are here. Hey, Stephanie, how are you doing? Hi, Carl. Good to see you. Hey, Garden, nice to see you. And I'll let you all tune in and we'll talk about this. So what do you think? Have you all been watching the Republican National Convention? Did you watch the Democratic National Convention? Were you participating in the discussion on Twitter? What was your best thing about it? What did you like? What didn't you like about the conventions? They were both, for the most part, virtual, but they did have live elements. There was more live elements in the RNC than the DNC, but I would love to hear what you think. Please post comments and we'll make sure we put them out there. And so I want to say, hey, Margie, hey, Chuck, how you doing? Thank you so much for tuning in. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Mr. Calvin Tucker in. Calvin Tucker, how you doing today?
I'm fine, Cherri, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this real talk. It is very essential that your audience hear both sides of this issue, because I think, what the Republicans are talking about, similarly what the Democrats, is about where we go from here, the accomplishments that we've achieved, and then where we go as a human race beyond this point. And I think the Republicans are going to make their case as they have made their case over the last couple of nights, and certainly culminating with the speech by the president.
Yeah, and so we'll be hearing. We've heard from the First Lady, Melania Trump. We've also heard from Vice President Mike Pence yesterday, and of course, President Donald Trump will be speaking today. So what did you think of the RNC? I mean, did you watch the DNC, first of all?
Well, no, unfortunately, as the PA GOP Director of Engagement and Advancement, I travel around the Commonwealth. In fact, I was on one of my tours. Since September, I've traveled over 6,000 miles around this Commonwealth, recruit and talk about the virtues of the Republican Party and the virtues of African Americans, Latino, Hispanic, and Asian Americans participating fully in this process. So while I was on my tour, I was not able to catch the Democratic National Convention, but I've also saw some recaps of that convention. But obviously, I've been able to see most of the Republican convention.
Yeah. And so how long have you been a Republican, Mr. Tucker?
So I've been a Republican 40-some years. Day one of my registration, I registered as a Republican. My parents were Republicans. I have a lot of quality Democrat elected and appointed friends. But throughout my life, I have maintained my registration as a Republican, because I believe that if we are to advance particularly, then we understand that everything we do and touch in this society has political ramifications, and so we need to understand both sides of the process, not just the Democrat side, but also the Republican side, and we need to engage in both communities, political communities, if we're going to achieve power or empower our communities to grow out of the issues that we're in.
Yeah. And I got to ask you this. I mean, a lot of, I went to a virtual press conference today. A lot of Pennsylvania Republicans endorsing Vice President Joe Biden today. And there was also a subsequent virtual press conference with a lot of Pennsylvania Republicans supporting the president. Is this what do you see happening here within the Pennsylvania Republican Party?
Well, so let's just say this: there are a lot of Democrats supporting the president. There are a lot of Republicans supporting the vice president Biden as well. So this is everybody has right to support whomever they believe will lead the country in the best direction. So there are some Democrats that support Republicans, and there are some Republicans that support Democrats, and there are some independents that support both parties, and that's the goodness of the democracy in which we live, is that we have an individual choice. One great political philosopher once said that there are no permanent friends or permanent enemies, only permanent interests. So if you see that the president is in your best interest and that he has achieved or accomplished over 3.5 or 3.75 of his term in your interest, then you're going to support him. If you believe that Vice President Biden, over his stint in government, and it's been a long stint, is in the best interest of your community, then you're going to support him as well.
And I got to jump in here because one of the things when I saw you at the Black Voices for Trump event, I actually was surprised. There were quite a few Black people there. It was packed, and it was almost, in some ways, it was like a lot of there were a lot more Black people who were supportive of the president. And one of the things you said was there's a lot more Black people supporting President Donald Trump than you might think.
Oh, yeah. Well, so let me say this. I coordinated that event in North Philly. The senior pastor is a chaplain of one of the organizations that I chair across this Commonwealth. And I thought it was important to bring, as I did in 2016, as I was the media surrogate for candidate Donald Trump, I brought him into North Philly at the View, which is part of Greater Exodus Church.
I remember that I was there with
and I had 15 African American business, civic, and religious leaders in the room with the president, and you were represented by, I think, 89 or 100 media folks in the room as well. And he talked about his aspirations for the African American community at that time, and I thought it was very important that our community hear that, our community have an opportunity to question him about those issues, and so last year I actually brought the Black Voices into North Philadelphia, of which I am a advisory board member of. And I thought that was important, that we begin to have those same dialogues of the promises that he made in 2016 and the promises that he has fulfilled up to that point in his administration.
And there were, and one of the things he actually got 13% of the Black male vote.
Right.
Why do you think so? And then, I saw Herschel Walker. There were just a number. And as people ask, could you adjust your camera? They're trying to see if they can see you a little bit.
Oh, let's see. I may have to move back. Unfortunately, my laptop is just where I do most of my Zoom.
But there is I know the 13% of Black men voted for President Donald Trump in the last term. One of the things you said was you suspected that number would increase to almost 18%, maybe even 20%. And it seems like the Republicans took a hard try. They were going hard in the paint for that Black vote. A number of Black speakers talking about this. Could you talk about that? There's direct outreach and specific outreach And it seemed like to me directed at African American men.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's directed at African Americans, Latino, Hispanic, and Asian Americans, right? Because this president believes that a rising tide lifts all boats. And if you look at his accomplishments economically, the lowest unemployment for African Americans, Latino, Hispanic, and Asian Americans in history. We've gone from 21% down to 5.5%. So, when you create opportunity zones, principally in urban communities, although there are some in suburban and rural communities as well, and I'm speaking from an urban community standpoint, when you think about those things where you're creating opportunity zones and resulting from that investments that are moving directly into those communities, I think Black folks in general start looking at that and say these are accomplishments that we can get behind because they create jobs and opportunity and entrepreneurship. They put money in our pocket, right? So that's why I believe that you're going to have a significant number of African Americans that will support this president in reelecting him for 4 more years.
And before we go into some of the details of things, one of the things I learned at the Black Voices for Trump event was a lot of Black people support President Donald Trump quietly. Why is that? They don't necessarily put it out there. They don't post it on Instagram, Facebook all the time. But Black people are like quiet supporters of the president, and talk about that and some of the feedback you've gotten from Black Trump supporters.
So yeah, and that's interesting. That's not just Black folks. As I've traveled, like I said, 23 counties across this Commonwealth, counties where I probably is the only African American that have been in that county in probably the last year or so. And many of those folks are quiet supporters of the president. But example I used to give in 2016, and it's a little more relevant today. I have played basketball with about 28 to 30 guys for 30 some years. And all of them are Democrats. I'm the only Republican in it. And they all know that I'm a Republican. They all know that I have been professionally supportive of my candidates. And I talk about the virtues and some of the foibles of those candidates as well. But many of them in this last cycle would come to me separately and say, Cal, your guy, this president, this candidate is saying the right things. And in fact, he's done some of the right things when we look at our financial condition, when we look at how we are driving out of poverty and unemployment. And we're going to, they're doing this separately, and we're going to support him. Yeah. But don't tell anybody. Okay. Yeah. Because people do not want to be challenged and confronted and ostracized because of all of the venom that has been spewed against this president, who was once loved by the Black community because he saved boxing. He owned a football team. He had a significant number of supporters. He recently received the Man of the Year award. For the things that he's done for historically Black colleges, created a funding base for Black colleges that does not renew annually, something for the next 15 years. Now, no other president did that. And so when people look at those kind of accomplishments, now they may have some problems with personality and all of those things. But look, I have an uncle that I don't like, but he delivers. And this president has delivered consistently, despite all of the things that surround him as a leader.
Yeah, and let's dig into that. We have a number of people. We have a couple questions, and I want to put this out here because I had to do this topic because I have to say, and I got a lot of when I did the story about Black Voices for Trump, we got a ton of clicks on the KYW News Radio website. A lot of times because people were like, and then people were shocked. And I was slightly shocked, but once I started talking to the supporters, I wasn't shocked anymore.
Right.
And I realized it, and people were, it was almost like a support group in some ways. People wanted to find ways to support and go and be advocates without the ridicule that you mentioned. So I got to go back in because you mentioned that President Donald Trump has delivered for the Black community, and you mentioned HBCUs. You mentioned a few things. If you were to give the laundry list, because this was one of the arguments that was made at the Black Voices for Trump event. What are some of the things you view as being delivered? And then we'll go and talk about another topic in just a second.
Right. So, I mean, I think unemployment is key because when you look at our communities across this city, across the state, and across nationally, you look at the urban communities, right? Many of our problems result from a social economic problem, right? That is, there may not be enough jobs available. Now, this president created 7.1, and this is a talking point, but he created 7.1 million jobs prior to the pandemic being exported in from China. And I think that's an accomplishment because what it did was it created a participation rate for those who were seeking work to be able to go out and get those jobs. Again, when I talk about these opportunity zones, when his 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act was enacted, right, in that was not only tax cut for the middle class, but it also was the creation of these opportunity zones in there are 88 just in Philadelphia, and there are projects, buildings, and shopping centers and apartment buildings being built. And even if you have an existing business, you can get funding for those businesses in those communities.
But Calvin, I got to stop you there because the pandemic has sort of changed the game. That was great. And now the pandemic and Black people, Black communities have been ravaged by the pandemic. More of us have died. We didn't have access to testing. I mean, the Black doctors had to get together in Philadelphia and test Black people on their own. I mean, how do you think his leadership in the pandemic impacts that analysis?
Well, so yeah, I mean, you could certainly blame the president, but when you look at who is supposed to deliver the PPP to the community, to the Black community, to the Latino community.
Well, the PPP left Black folks out. It did.
Yeah, what I'm saying is all of that's delivered by your local institutions, i.e. the local government and the institutions within the government. Now, did Philadelphia say we don't have enough supply to provide to all communities? I've never heard those issues. All I hear from the president and the task force, and I see their actions, they made all of that PPE equipment available. Now, it is a matter of local states and municipalities to distribute to all of those particular sources. But federal government is not delivering directly to local communities.
But don't you think our country would have done better had someone just said, everybody needs to wear masks, everybody fall in line? Like he says he's a strong leader. Everybody fall in line for this period of time. We would have had this thing nipped in the bud, don't you think?
Well, you know what? I mean, if you look at what the World Health Organization said, and you look at what the CDC said, I mean, all of the education on this pandemic, on this coronavirus, is fluid. It has not been stable. Many of the professionals, medical professionals that we heard early on in this process, none of them were talking about it's mandatory to have masks, it's mandatory to be socially distanced, it's mandatory to do those things. All of that, as they learned more about the effects of this virus, they started to begin to implement those things. And the president and his task force began to start talking about those things. Now, what they're saying is, look, you have state rights, and states can make their own choice. The federal government, and that's the difference between Democrats.
But the states, but President Donald Trump, if he says something, his Republican comrades fall in line. They just do. And if he had said, I think this pandemic is super serious, everybody needs to wear a mask, his Republican governors would have done that.
Well, so again, if you look at the Republican states, most of them fell in line with what the recommendations were of the public health professionals. If you look at the Democrat state, i.e. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, they didn't. They came around to some of those things, and it is now restrictive where, again, if you want to look at some of the international communities, Italy and others, Switzerland, where they are not adhering to these strict guidelines, and yet the pandemic is subsiding in those communities. So I believe that across the board, we have to we understand what the guidelines are. We still have to begin to open our communities up, because the collateral damage of the community staying close and folks staying bunkered in their homes like I am and you are. This has a long-term effect on us and our children, who are every day clamoring for social intercourse and interaction with their friends and their peers and schools. We have to get those folks back into the marketplace safely and protected.
And I want to ask you a question from Carl E. Tucker. He put it here. He says, as an African-American male, what will be the Republican, what will the Republican Party handle? How are they handling? How do you view their handling of the ongoing racial issues? I mean, we just had another police-involved shooting in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Black man shot 7 times in the back. He's currently paralyzed and in critical condition there. And I mean, your thoughts on how he's handling this racial unrest?
No, it's racial unrest. And we, as human beings, we have to deal with social injustice and police brutality and police abuse. I have been subject to some of that myself, but as I don't condemn the police department force as a complete unit because of some bad apples, but we have to deal with those issues as human beings, whether we're Republican or Democrats. Now, I also say that we have to begin to deal with some other serious issues where every night 5 and 6 children are being killed by our own community, right? No one, I don't see Black Lives Matter at 29th and Dauphin or at 15th and Susquehanna. I don't see them out there fighting. But again,
and I just want to say that as someone who does cover, Black Lives Matter is a separate movement, but I get it. As someone who does cover violence, there are marches just about every day. There are vigils every time a child gets murdered. We just had multiple days of hearings. So it's a misnomer. It's a misunderstanding to say that people are not trying to fight the inherent gun violence in Black communities, because I see it every single day.
I got it. I understand it. And I have a contract as a private consultant, on 52nd Street. And I witnessed a number of fatal events. And I didn't see the outpour, although I certainly saw neighbors out, but I didn't see a national cry. I didn't see our athletes and entertainers and the like, because those issues, again, as you know, there are a myriad of issues associated with that. There's inherent criminality. There's also, the social economic situation that exists. There's also some medical, mental things that has to be addressed as well in our community. And I think one thing that the president is doing is when you create opportunities in communities, right? Yeah. You begin the process of addressing some of those issues. Now, as human beings, we have to deal with that on a daily basis. The corrosiveness that's happening in our community, and that has to be an ongoing process for us. And if we see something, we have to say something. We can't keep that. I mean, I know it's a threat to our lives, potentially a threat to our lives if we do something, but we have to, as human beings, whether it's Republicans or Democrats or independents or, some of the other folks, we all have to be in this together.
Yeah. And I just want to, sort of, we're going to wrap up in the next few minutes, and I want to read some of the comments because there has been a real push, like I said earlier in this discussion, to get the black vote. What is your prediction? Do you think President Donald Trump's message is resonating with black voters, specifically with black men? I didn't see as many black women supporting or speaking on his behalf, because 98% of black women voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. But the black men, do you think he has a chance?
I think he has a chance. I predicted in 2016 that he would get between 12 and 15% because of those silent voters. He got 8%, right, which is better than the previous two Republican candidates, right? In this election, and as I indicated to you, I travel around this Commonwealth as the Director of Engagement and Advancement. And I was in Franklin County, which is 200 miles from Philadelphia, just last Saturday. And I talked to black folks and, again, Hispanics and others, and there's tremendous amount of support because they believe that, they know that once he's reelected, he'll serve 4 years. But beyond that, you have started a trend that whoever succeeds him must deliver for the black community, right?
Yeah.
And that's why I think he will win a significant number and that number is going to be somewhere between, I would say, 8 and 20%, more like 12 to 15% of the black vote. You'll also see black women coming out and supporting him as well.
Yeah. In a much smaller number, I will say that, much smaller number. He has something, I don't know, because I saw some Herschel Walker, so many, senators, you had all kinds of black men, attorney generals, black men coming out and stumping for Donald Trump. And I was just shocked to see so many doing this. I wasn't shocked. I take it back. I wasn't shocked, but
I'm saying black men are beginning to step up and be the leaders of communities and families that they need to be when they see something going right that's going to benefit communities and their family. Then they're going to support that. Now, I have not heard, and what the vice president said, that if you don't vote for him, you ain't black. I thought that was very offensive. I think he has some qualities.
But a lot of people feel like he made up for all of that when he selected Senator Kamala Harris as his running mate.
Right. So you can have personal animus, but his advisor said, look, you got to make up for this. You got to put a black woman on it, and a black woman that challenged him on his own livelihood in the Senate and in Congress, that he was opposed in many cases. And 1993 crime bill that put more black folks incarcerated more black folks than others, and things that he said. So look, I got it. If you believe that because I marry well, that I'm a better guy, then that's okay. So he selected a black woman. So that's going to make up for all of his sins, right? We'll forgive him for his sins. Now he's going to be the president until he's no longer the president.
We'll stop it right. We'll wrap it up here because a lot of people do believe that President Donald Trump has committed a lot of sins as well. And so we'll read a couple of these comments before I give you the final statement, because we do have our second guest coming up in just a moment. And let me just see there was a lot of comments here. Angie Bird started it off. She said, we need to listen with an open mind and not judgment. There are many black Republicans supporting Trump. There's something to be learned here. And that's why we did this segment, because I think a lot of people don't realize that folks keep their support quiet and they're actually supporting. We answered Sonny's questions, and Manuel Glenn had a lot of comments to say. He says that Trump did not create jobs. He was giving a booming economy and stamped his name on it. People are not stupid. That's what Manuel Glenn says. And April Everett says the same thing. He inherited a booming economy. Unemployment was consistently going down when he came in. And then Kiera Gray says there was no leadership to guide states, period. The fact that he said most of the states fell in line is indicative of the fact that there was no leadership encouraging and warning people of the intelligence the federal government was receiving. So those are just some of the comments. There's a lot of different points of view, but I hope people at least recognize, and this is the reason why I brought Calvin here tonight. Again, Calvin Tucker is the Pennsylvania GOP Director of Engagement and Advancement, because there is a lot of people in the Black community who do support President Donald Trump. And you may not know who they are, but there's a lot of people.
Right.
And we have to keep an open mind and hear what they have to say. And so thank you. You got anything coming up, Calvin?
Well, I have something pretty much every night next week, but more importantly, I have been meeting with, Asian Americans. I've been meeting with Muslim Americans, because people see change and they want to be included in this change agent. And so I would respond to two of your commenters that I don't know any president that takes over an economy or inherits, a international issue from another president, that they don't build on those issues. And I think this president, whatever the economy was when he got it, whatever the international community was when he got it, he built on those things. And that's the sign of a good leader, to build on those. When President Obama took over, he built on the economy and corrected to some extent the economy during that period of time. So that's what a leader does. He takes credit for things that may have been in the works, but he also adds value to all of the things as well.
And we're going to wrap up here, Calvin R. Tucker. I mean, I think if people support President Donald Trump, maybe they should speak up about it, because everybody's so quiet. And that's one of the things Manuel Glenn said. More people need to, people are afraid. There's not this open dialogue, and we need to come together and talk about these issues. But I want to say thank you so much for coming on. Calvin R. Tucker is the Pennsylvania GOP Director of Engagement and Advancement. Sir, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us tonight.
Thank you very much for having me, and your audience for indulging me in my few words.
Thank you so much. You have a wonderful evening. All right. So thank you for everybody. Let me get rid of this. Thank you for everybody who took the time to comment and ask questions. Would love to hear your thoughts on Mr. Calvin Tucker. He came on, and there's a lot of Black folks, y'all, who support President Donald Trump. Got to put it up here again. In 2016, 13% of Black men voted for President Donald Trump. When I went to the Black Voices for Trump event, a lot of them said they don't tell people because their family gets so upset and everybody is so judgy, but they quietly are supporting them. So I hope you guys kept an open mind and at least listened to what he had to say. He had points, and we need to be open-minded about folks in our community. So moving on, I'm delighted to have our second guest. As everybody knows, I am a strong proponent of voting rights. Always have been. I've been registering people to vote since I was 16 years old, before I could even vote. And this year we have seen a big effort to stop people from voting, to suppress voters. Okay. And so I started thinking about who bled for our right to vote, who stood on the line for this right, especially for people of color, Black folks specifically, when there were poll taxes and all kinds of crazy tests you had to take at polls, and you had to get grandfathered in. Well, I'm so delighted to have Ms. Sheyann Christburg here with us. She was known as Martin Luther King Jr.'s smallest freedom fighter. She was 9 years old on March 7, 1965 in Selma, Alabama, which is known as Bloody Sunday, Bloody Sunday. So I have her here with me. I'm going to bring her on into the stream. How you doing, Ms. Christburg? Nice to see you.
I'm doing.
I think you need to log out of, there you go. Say it again. Go ahead. You had two up. Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, you need to log out of one of the, you're logged in 2 accounts. Just pick one and log out. You're logged in on 2 accounts and it's looping. So you need to pick one of them and log out the other one. You're logged in as Andre and as Sheyann. So you want to log out Andre?
Yes.
So I don't know how to do that. You have to log out on your end.
Okay.
So I'm gonna I'm gonna wait till one of them disappears. I'm gonna just log out one of them because both of them is causing a loop. So just log in, and we're gonna let Miss Christburg log out. She's logged in as on 2 different accounts. There you go. She logged out both of them. She's got to log back in. So we're gonna wait for her. But let me just tell you about Sheyann Christburg. She was there on Bloody Sunday in 1965. She was 9 years old at the time. And as you remember, Congressman John Lewis was there. His head was cracked open as folks tried to cross the Pettus Bridge. And it was a bloody day. So I want to get her recount of that. She's logging back in right now. Please tag a friend and share this video as we deal with voter suppression right now. Miss Christburg, there you go. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm good. Perfect. This is perfect. So first of all, are you feeling good right now? I know COVID-19 has a lot of folks locked in.
Oh yes, I'm feeling good in spite of. I mean, COVID has impacted all of our lives, and as a result of that, I'm a believer of this, Cherri. Sometimes in the worst situations, you have to make the best of them, but sometimes in worst situations, your best blessings come.
Yeah,
and I've been busy working, keeping myself busy, doing the work that I have a passion for, and certainly working on pushing the vote for this critical upcoming election.
that's amazing. And you've been, you are an advocate in many ways. Tell people all the work that you do, and then we'll go back and talk about it. It started when you were just a child.
Most certainly. I was 8 years old, growing up in George Washington Carver Homes projects from a family of 8. You know, it was rough. It was when I was 7 when I met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, when I first met Dr. King, he gravitated my heart as that little girl. And as a result of him gravitating my heart, he became so special to me as that little girl that I became very disobedient child. My parents couldn't do anything with me in the midst of turbulent times when it was risky. It wasn't ordinary for young people, and especially children, to become a part of the civil rights movement in Selma. So naturally, my parents weren't involved because they could not only lose their jobs, but they could even lose their lives. And many African Americans were thinking, you know, on the same wavelength. And because of them telling me to stay out of that mess, many times that I would be disobedient, that encouraged me even more to be involved, because after having met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Congressman Lewis, and Dr. C.T. Vivian and others, you know, I had become deeply embedded in that struggle because I was there right in the midst of it. So I was seeing and witnessing things that my parents and my peers could not feel. And I felt some of it, even as, you know, growing up as that little girl. So it surely continued to impel me to make a difference and do something that will help my parents, because I would soon realize that they could not vote.
Yeah.
They didn't have the right to vote. And because they were afraid to be a part of that change, I had made up in my mind, Cherri, that I wasn't going to let nobody turn me around.
Wow. And I'm showing right now to everybody this photo of you with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. here and you're a little girl, and he's smiling, and this was a happy occasion that you were with Dr. King.
Most certainly, this was the successful march from Selma to Montgomery. This was after the Bloody Sunday March. So, of course, I was disobedient again, and I was participating on that march. And, you know, during that time, for this particular march, we would stop at different intervals from the march from Selma to Montgomery. And on that particular stop, that's when I had gone up to Dr. King to let him know that I was on that march. And later, he would find out that my parents didn't even know that I was on that march. And he had his entourage would call, you know, one of his secretaries who was a part of that march and a part of his entourage. They would later call my parents to let them know that I was in good care and they were going to see to me getting back home safely.
And so let's back this up, because you realized the injustice that was happening to Black people and specifically to your family, being unable to vote. And as a child in single digit years, you wanted to get involved.
Most certain, you know, segregation shared back in the 60s when I was 7 and 8 years old, growing up during that time. I mean, it was real. It was live and in living colors. For me, first and foremost, I grew up in a poor housing area. And I saw the difference between the housing area that I lived in versus the housing area for poor whites. Theirs were better. I saw in other instances, on many occasions, when I would see the for white only signs and the for colored only signs. In many places that my parents would take me in, I had become a very inquisitive little girl. I would often ask them questions. Why their side looks better than ours? Why can't we go over there? Why are these signs up? We couldn't even use the same water fountain. Our schools weren't integrated at that time.
Yeah.
And there were certain neighborhoods that we couldn't go in. Certain restaurants we couldn't go in. And even when we went to the theater, as I continued to grow up during the 60s, the Blacks had to sit upstairs and the whites had to sit downstairs. And most of all, what I learned as I matriculated in that movement with Dr. King and Congressman Lewis, I learned that we did not have the right to vote as African Americans. And I wanted to be a part of that. And I was. I would continue to sneak out of my back door, not only to attend mass meetings, but anytime they had protests and marches that I was familiar with, as many that I could be a part of, instead of going to school, I would go participate on those marches. I would participate during those protests. And many times I would be threatened by my parents, but they just couldn't do anything with this little girl because I had a great sense of determination that I wanted to do something to make a difference. Even as that little girl, it was a chord that struck me. And listen, you wouldn't even have any idea of what this was like if you weren't in the midst of those courageous people.
Yeah, and I got to keep putting that picture up there because you were just 8 years old on Bloody Sunday, 1965, March 7th, in Selma. Tell me, I mean, you're this little girl, and you're there, and it seems like all HELL breaks loose. Tell us how you, first of all, tell us what happened that day and what you were feeling as it was happening.
Well, certainly, you know, many threats have been made about the possibilities of what would happen to anyone who would participate on that particular march. And even in spite of my parents telling me that I couldn't march on that day, again, I had made up in my mind, Cherri. I wrote them a note trying to express to them why I needed to participate. And I'll never forget going out to the now historic Brown Chapel AME Church, which sat right in the middle of the projects in which I lived at that time. And I remember going out there on that particular day. And normally when I would go and join the foot soldiers, and back then we called them freedom fighters. Normally, when I would go to Brown Chapel Church, I would go straight to the front pew and join in the singing of the freedom songs and the prayers that were always in the presence of everyone who were there. But on this particular day, I remember going and sitting on that back pew. And as I sat there, I listened to the late Hosea Williams, and I listened to the late Congressman John Lewis as he gave instructions, special instructions to all of the marchers who would participate on this particular day. And as I listened to them, I still was making up in my mind that, yes, I'm going to be a part of this march, even in spite of. And of course, everyone was asked to go out in front of the church and line up. And as everyone was leaving the church and going to line up, there were many who were still trying to discourage me and tell me that I didn't need to march on that particular day. So I went out and I saw this lady that I knew, the late Mrs. Margaret Moore, who was one of the teachers who stood against the odds during that time, because you didn't have many teachers who would be courageous enough to participate. But I knew Mrs. Moore, and I saw her line up, and I went and I stood by her, and I told Mrs. Moore that I was going to march. And of course, she tried to discourage me, and she started seeing me crying. And as I was crying, she just took me by my hands and said, "Come on, child." And that march would start. And as we made our way to the Edmund Pettus Bridge on this particular day, Cherri, I'll never forget, after the special instructions had been given to all of the marchers to keep their heads forward, quietly, march peacefully, nonviolence, in spite of what would happen on that day. That little girl was looking from side to side as that march would make its way to the Edmund Pettus Bridge on that day. And as I looked side to side, I wasn't keeping my head forward. I could look at the whites who were throwing things at all of the marchers, trying to distract them. Some would even come up and spit on them. And some were just constantly saying nasty words to them. But the marchers just kept on walking, making their way with their heads held up high forward. And I remember getting on that Edmund Pettus Bridge that day. I'll never forget this, Cherri. I was midway of the marchers with Mrs. Moore. And as we got closer to that bridge, my heart had begun to beat faster, because for some reason I just knew something was going to happen. And then as we got midway on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, I'll never forget, when I looked down, I saw hundreds of policemen with tear gas masks, state troopers on horses. I saw the dogs and the billy clubs, and I just knew that something was going to happen. But I couldn't run, just like no others who were participating on that march. I remember everybody praying. We were asked to kneel down and pray. And after we had prayed, the leaders of that march on that day was Congressman John Lewis and Hosea Williams. And they asked them to turn the marchers around. However, they refused. And Cherri, after they refused, racism unleashed its brutality upon us. Tear gas had begun to burst in the air. People had begun to be beaten down with billy clubs by policemen as if they weren't human beings. The dogs and the horses had begun to push their way into the crowd, just trampling over people. And I could see people trying to run back to Brown Chapel AME Church with tear gas constantly being sprayed. And tear gas has a very burning and painful sensation. And I could see people running as I was running, trying to make my way back home from that march. And I could even see people crying and crawling and falling as I continued to run. Then there was Hosea Williams coming to try to comfort me as I was running, and he picked me up in his arms, and my little feet were still galloping in his arms. And I turned to him with my eyes burning very badly from the tear gas. And I was crying, just devastated. And I said to him in my childish voice, "Put me down because you are not running fast enough." And he would continue to comfort me and others as we made our way back to George Washington Carver Projects. And they would go back to, the marchers would go back to Brown Chapel AME Church where they started. But I was trying to make my way home, and there my parents were standing in the door, and my dad had his shotgun, Cherri. And they opened the door as if they were waiting for this child to come home. And I ran completely in between them, just devastated, up the stairs to my room. And they would come behind to comfort me. I was just, it was one of the most traumatic experiences of my life. But on this particular day, Cherri, this was the day that I really, really knew and discovered the true meaning of what that movement was about. There was a song that we used to sing all the time. I would go to the mass meetings and sing freedom songs. And there was one particular song, "Oh freedom over me, and before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." So as that little girl, having been impacted by one of the most traumatic experiences of my life during the movement, I started writing my funeral arrangements in my own little childish words, because I had made up in my mind even more that I wasn't going to let nobody turn me around, and I wanted to still be a part of that movement because I knew that we had to fight even more.
So even though you were traumatized, I mean, clearly, and I can't even imagine how afraid you must have been, or was it fear? What was the emotion that you felt? Was it indignation? Was it a combination of emotions?
I think
when all that was happening.
I think it was a combination of things, because number one, even as I felt that we would be challenging and threats had been made about what would happen, I never thought it would be to that extent. That's number one.
So your child mind couldn't even have imagined.
No, I couldn't imagine that we would be threatened with with that type of brutality. Let me just put it that way. And the magnitude of that, I couldn't even fathom that. And in my mind, you know, I thought we would just probably just stop, you know, and have to turn around. But to meet brutality in that way, no, I don't think any of us knew it would be that way. And then on the other hand, being a child, you know, even though it was traumatic for me, but it encouraged me, and it really struck such a chord with me. It really wanted me to be more a part of the change, being that little girl, based upon that experience. Because, you know, Dr. King always talked about the philosophy of nonviolence. He always talked about the possibilities of what can happen in the midst of fighting for what you were standing up for that was right. And, you know, all of the people who were courageous enough during that time to be a part of that movement, they knew that there would be challenges. They knew that there would be threat, and we would be met with different threats. But never would I have thought in my mind that we would have been traumatized, brutalized in the manner in which people were in an effort to fight for African Americans to gain their right to vote.
And I got to ask you this because I think, and I always ask, when you're fighting for a cause, would you be willing to die for it? Did you even have any idea that you could lose your life that day? That could have happened, especially with you being so young. And you seem to have been in a position to write your funeral arrangements, knowing that this could be an outcome. How did you even process something like that at such a young age, when a lot of us decades later still have a hard time processing something like that?
Well, being that little girl, I had the opportunity to be very knowledgeable of Jimmy Lee Jackson's death before Dr. King would even come to Selma. And as a matter of fact, Sheyann, my dad took me to his funeral. And that was very brutal to me before I even met Dr. Martin Luther King. I told my dad that I really wanted to go to his funeral because I knew it was wrong. Yeah. See, as a little girl, I was able to process the difference between black and white and what was right and wrong when it came to our color. Okay. So I was learning that a little bit more about that before Dr. King had come, or even before I met Dr. King, before he came to Selma to join that movement. But let me tell you this, when he came, when he came, there was so much substance. There was so much that he really poured into the hearts and souls of all of those courageous, because number one, you had to have courage to want to be involved in something that was so risky and so challenging. So many of those young people came from other places. There were some from Selma, but many came from other places. They didn't even have anything but a sleeping bag, but they came there to make a difference. They came there for change. They came there to help join in that movement. And so by me being that little girl and being just in the midst of people who, first by me getting to know Dr. King and then listening to him. I didn't understand everything. I couldn't process everything the way that some of the older people could, but there were some common things, common elements that I could process. And with that, seeing and witnessing what I witnessed and the way in which my experience traumatized me as that little girl on Bloody Sunday, it just pushed me further to want to be a part of change, because I knew that's what it was going to take in order for the wrong to be right.
I got to ask you, what did it feel like as a child when the Voting Rights Act was passed and the law was on your side, and it seemed like all that sacrifice, all that trauma was actually worth it? Did you understand that the law changed? Yeah.
Yes, most certainly it was worth it. I mean, you had much blood, sweat, and tears were shed in an effort for people to gain that right to vote. But that's what it took. And it took courageous people to come together for one common cause. And everybody was clear on Dr. King's message, and everybody was clear on what the mission was. So most certainly it was worth it. And that leads me to, there were certain things that were happening in the midst of that. Viola Liuzzo, who was the white young woman who had come from her home to join the movement, she was killed for coming to be a part of that change, just transporting African Americans from Montgomery back to Selma. Jonathan Daniels, and I knew Viola Liuzzo. I met her. She stayed in our home. She pierced my ears when I was that little girl. So I got to know people like Viola Liuzzo very well. And they taught me a lot. They helped to diffuse some things and to give me the clarity that I needed on things when we weren't even at the church. Meeting Jonathan Daniel, who stayed right next door to my house with my best friend's family. Got to know him in a very special way. He used to come and give us special time explaining to myself and my best friend Rachel when we were children about what, not only what was going on, but what needed to happen for change and why he was there. He took us to the Dairy Queen one day to buy an ice cream cone.
And so these were actual people in your life. This isn't just.
That's right.
For a lot of us, you know, we read about this, but these people who were dying and this way were people you knew as a child who had touched your life, been kind to you, been a part of your story. And so this was very real and visceral to you.
Most certainly, Sherry. These people all had an impact on my life.
Yeah.
And, you know, at the time I didn't know it, but as I continued to grow, you know, I was careful in my decision with everything that I did, because, for instance, me as that little girl, as I continued to matriculate in school, all of my siblings shared, they were a part of the Black school system. They didn't even want to try to integrate the school because they knew it would be a challenge. But of course I did. And I was one of the 8 African-American students in Selma, Alabama, to integrate the schools there, because that's something I wanted to do. It was just something embedded in me after being in the midst of all of these people and knowing what fighting supposed to be about, for something that you knew was right, and standing up for something that you knew was right, and standing up for something that you believed in. And see, that was embedded in me as that little girl through Dr. King, through Jonathan, through Congressman Lewis and others. So, you know, I never wanted to hate any white person. I never felt that. I never felt had the feeling of hating white people, because I was taught differently. Mm-hmm. And because of that, all I wanted to do was to make sure that I was given the same equality that whites had, because growing up as that little girl, I wasn't just a disobedient girl. I was a smart little girl.
Super smart. You were sneaking out and going to market. Yeah.
I kept my grades up, and then Dr. King, every time he would come to Selma, that's what he would always ask me, how was I doing in school? And he encouraged me to go to college. It wasn't my parents, because they, you know, back in the 60s, African Americans, for the most part, unless you were middle class, my folks didn't have money to even think about sending me to college. But because Dr. King encouraged me to not only work hard, be smart, make good grades in school, he encouraged me to go to college.
Yeah.
And because of him telling me that, I made sure that I insisted with my parents that I go to college. And of course, they couldn't afford it at the time that I went, but we got help to go. Yeah. So it's just so many ways that I was impacted by Dr. King and Congressman Lewis. And so that's why many of my choices were different from my peers and from my siblings. And so if we would look back right now from the 60s and my growing up and being impacted and being right in the midst of people like Dr. King, Congressman Lewis, Jonathan Daniels, and Viola Luuso, David Reeves, all of those people, you would say today, we using the word mentored. They mentored me. They helped to impact and shape my life as to the person that I am today. And many of the choices that I have made, because it was people like them who touched this little poor girl's heart and mind and made a difference. So I knew when I went to college, I knew that I wanted to work with young people, especially the least of these, the underprivileged, and helping them to build self-esteem and self-confidence in an effort to break out of non-productive patterns and become productive leaders, and to encourage academic excellence and etiquette training. All of these things came from how I was impacted by the lives of others, and also being proud of how they helped to shape my life.
And I got to ask you, I mean, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered just a couple of years after this march, and you were still a child and had to experience that. And most recently, Congressman John Lewis passed away after decades of service to his state, to his country, to this world. Just your thoughts on those two mentors of yours, they and each, kind of passing on in different sectors of your life. One as a child, and one as a seasoned woman, and having witnessed all in between.
Well, let me say this first and foremost. I've never met two men during my lifetime that have exemplified a power of humanity and authenticity as Congressman John Lewis and Dr. Martin Luther King. I've always known, even since meeting Dr. King and meeting Congressman Lewis, and of course, I had more tenure with Congressman Lewis after Dr. King's death, because I had the opportunity to meet Congressman. As a matter of fact, Dr. King introduced me to Congressman Lewis when I was 7 years old, because he was a part of his entourage at that time. And at that time, when I was 7, 8 years old, Congressman Lewis was like 15, 16 years younger than myself. So I got to know Congressman Lewis a little more, because I had more tenure with him from childhood even until his death. So we kept in touch with each other. And of course, I followed him from that time until his death. And he was a man who it's so hard to talk about all of the things in terms of how and what he contributed to my life. I never, and I'm going to say this, I've never seen a man who was so consistent with his personality as I did, and his genuineness as I did with Congressman Lewis. From the time that I met him and all of those years until he turned 80, he stayed the same. He was very consistent, a man of peace who truly embodied, Dr. King's nonviolent philosophy with a heart of forgiveness. We all saw that in everything that he did. He was our voice. He was a voice for the voiceless, and he was hope for the hopeless. And I mean, it's so much we can say about him.
Yeah.
But I stayed connected with him, and I'm so glad that I did. I had an opportunity to meet Congressman Lewis and be with him on different levels. And there are some things that I'll never forget about him. He was, as I got older, he was responsible for me having a visit to the White House when President Clinton and Hillary Clinton was at the White House. He wanted to make sure that happened. But there are numerous experiences that I had with him up until his death.
And I got to say this, I mean, because we're going to wrap up in the next couple of minutes, but I got to bring this to current day, because there's so many, you see young people sort of leading today's movement to end racism. It's almost like the movement that you were a part of as a young girl is continuing to this day.
Right.
It's like you've handed the baton to other young kids. Just your word to them, because you had something in you as a child that a lot of people don't even get as an adult. And it's like everybody there at that time was very young, and people, I mean, Congressman Lewis was in his 20s, and a very young man. And so all of you were out there, and you see your comments on what's happening now, and you're just talking to some of the people, the younger folks here, as a young person who joined a movement, and I mean, and was determined and stayed in it and persisted. Just your comments to them.
Well, my comments to young people, first and foremost, is to, number one, I tell them to always love themselves first. Because before you can love others, you got to love yourself. And secondly, I always believe in trying to inspire and motivate young people to be the best version of themselves that they could be. And in my program and the many works that I've done with young people and college students for 41 years, I still work with young people. I try to encourage them to, whatever their passions are, they need to have the stick-to-itiveness with it, and they need to have a purpose beyond their passion. And the purpose, always begins with greatness. Now, in today's modern movement, it's important for me to continue to encourage young people to love, to lift each other, to listen, to learn, and to look and become aware of what's going on, not only in their communities, but local, state, and on a national level. Because the more well-read you are, the more that you know that's going on, then the more intelligent you are, the more wiser you are, the better your choices are in terms of making the decisions for change. So I encourage young people, especially today, to, number one, never to think that you're too young to make a difference. Never think that, because it was when I was 7, when I was out there in the fields and on the streets fighting with the other foot soldiers trying to get African Americans registered to vote. So I encourage them to never think that they are too young to become a change agent. The other thing is that I encourage young people to do is to always stand up for what they believe in that's right. And whenever you are doing anything as a change agent to make a difference, like we've seen with many young people of color when they came to protest after George Floyd's death, that was very encouraging to me to see young people come together all over the nation and for a common cause and protest. And they understood the mission, and they did it in a peaceful, nonviolent way.
Yeah.
And it took some organization, strategize, and mobilize. It really reflected on what I saw when I was that little girl growing up. So today it's important for our young people because they are the voices of hope. They are the vessels of change, and they are the instruments of peace and progress that we are leaning on now. So we got to be their ambassadors and their partners and supporting cast to support them in their efforts now and help to give them the proper training, the proper advice in terms of the fight and the challenges in which we are being plagued with today. But if they don't do anything else, they have to understand that when it all boils down to any of these problems in which we are being plagued with today, with systemic racism, with social injustices, racial discrimination, it still boils down to the vote.
Boils down to the vote.
It still boils down to the vote. So we got to not only continue to dialogue with our young people and our young adults, we got to continue to have dialogues and training sessions to inspire them, to educate them, for them to really know and become more familiar with the past, their past history that's really has come back to circle again.
Yeah, and it has come back to circle. And I want to as we get ready to wrap up, I want to give you some of the feedback that folks have been giving us. Disobedient done with heart eventually becomes trailblazer. That's what you were. Kateria says, what insight you had at a very young age. And Sonny said, you are a living legend.
Oh,
Such a wonderful thing. And people said, what, my own mother is in here. She said, my amazing and gripping story. The Reverend Dr. Mark Tyler says, thank you for this interview and thank you for your sacrifice. You got a full round of applause from Manuel Glenn. And what a powerful message. Great interview. And it boils down to the vote. So final words, Ms. Christburg, you've been excellent. I know you have a book that people can pick up. Please tell us about it. Because this is your story. I mean, and shout out to Laura Elam. She heard you speak and found your number and said, you need to call this woman. She is absolutely amazing. And you talked to me. You were so open to me. And I thank you for doing this and sharing your story, because I think more people need to hear it, especially as we deal with voter suppression today. And people have been taking their vote for granted, knowing what your sacrifice was and what you did at the tender age of 8 years old should inspire everybody.
Sure. The title of the book is Selma, Lord Selma, and you can purchase that book on Amazon. And then, Cherri, while I have this platform, I do want to say that I do speak across the country, and I'm doing many virtual presentations now, especially for our young people and adults. And my topics right now is my emphasis now is pushing the vote, giving young people the opportunity from a diverse standpoint to dialogue with each other and to become not only voters, even if they're not of age to vote, they still need to be a part of the voting process and become more educated on it. And of course, I do diversity training, and I do my speaking presentations on race, healing, and reconciliation.
Wow.
So right now, you know,
and what is your website?
My website is CheyenneWebGroup.com.
Wonderful.
Well, Sheyann Webb, and I could be reached at 334-538-3320.
I will share your information with the group. I'm going to put up here right now the website on CheyenneWebGroup.com. Check her out. Selma, Lord Selma is co-authored by Ms. Sheyann Webb Christburg. She is speaker. She's a speaker and presenter that inspires youth, does a litany of things. Please check out her website. And I will put a link to the book in this post, as well as a link to her website. Please check her out. Diversity training is going to be something, I think, Ms. Christburg, that it's going to just take off.
Yes.
It's already become very popular, but I think more and more companies are realizing that they are lacking and that they need folks in place to do this. So I want to say thank you so much. Ms. Sheyann Webb Christburg was there on Bloody Sunday at just 8 years old, marching on one of the most memorable days of this country, of this country's history in the battle for voting rights. So thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, for your presence. And we will share all your information. And thank you again to Laura Elam for connecting us. You were amazing. You were amazing. So there you go. Selma, authored by Sheyann Webb Christburg. She's a speaker and presenter. She was amazing. Y'all, thank y'all. So that is it for Real Talk with Cherri. It was wonderful to have this esteemed guest. Also, thank you to Calvin R. Tucker, Pennsylvania GOP Director of Engagement and Advancement. Y'all, there's a lot of Black folks out here voting Republican. So you got to open your mind. You got to understand that everybody might not agree with you. But you also have to understand there's a lot of people who fought for the rights that you currently have. So I just want to say thank you to everybody for tuning in. This was a little bit over time, but how can you stop Ms. Christburg from sharing such a gripping story? Got to put this up one more time, because that picture of her as a child, just 8 years old, with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. will always be one that I remember. So anyway, you guys have a wonderful evening, and see you next time on Real Talk with Cherri. Bye.